It took 25 years to solve this terrible case. An American university student left the party and disappeared without a trace. The police had a suspect from the very first days, but they couldn't prove his involvement. Only a few decades later, the author of one podcast discovered some terrible details of this case, attracting the attention of millions of people and forcing the police to reopen the investigation. After graduating from high school in 1996, Kristen entered California Polytechnic University. She worked as a lifeguard at a recreational center on campus in her free time. On May 25th that year, a large party was planned at the house of the student fraternity to celebrate the birthday of one of the students. Kristen was planning to go there, but her friends didn't want to go. The girl went to the fraternity house on her own. The party was unfolding in a typical American student style. A large company was drinking alcohol, listening to music, and having fun. That evening, Kristen drank too much, started feeling unwell, and at about 2 a.m. she went to her dorm. She could barely walk on her own. Noticing her on the street, two other students, Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis, decided to walk her home. They both attended that party. After a while, they were joined by another student who was also present at the party, Paul Flores. He offered to accompany Kristen to her dorm because his dorm was the closest to hers. Cheryl and Tim, who needed to go in a different direction, said goodbye to them and left. No one has seen Kristen alive since then. At first, her disappearance wasn't given much importance. Kristen's roommate, Margarita Campos, was the first one who started to worry. She was sure that her friend would return home after the party, but that never happened. The fact that all of Kristen's belongings, including her ID, wallet, and bank card, were left in her room only added to the worries. This meant that she couldn't just go somewhere. Margarita turned to the campus police only 2 days after the girl's disappearance. Apparently, she kept hoping that Kristen was fine and would return home. However, the campus police didn't take the roommate's worry seriously. It was the weekend preceding the National Day of Remembrance in the United States, a holiday dedicated to the fallen American servicemen. The local police officers simply decided that Kristen had gone home, and the fact that she left all her important belongings and documents in the dorm didn't seem to bother them at all. We should note that it took 7 hours to drive from the university campus to Kristen's house. This distance is too long to suddenly take off without any money and documents, especially in the middle of the night. A few days later, the local police decided to take the case and called the girl's parents. Kristen's mother said that her daughter hadn't come home in a long time and hadn't called her in the past few days. This call made her mother worry, and the parents went to the police. But still, the police weren't that eager to open an investigation. They stated that not a lot of time had passed since Kristen's disappearance, and she could simply be with her friends. And they started looking for her only on the 4th day after her disappearance. At first, volunteers were looking for the girl, but the search didn't give any results. The first person police interrogated was Paul Flores, who offered to walk Kristen to her dorm and was supposed to be the last person to see her. He told the detectives that he and Kristen had walked to his dorm, and after that they said goodbye, and she went home alone. He allegedly went to bed right after that. But there were inconsistencies in his story. His floor neighbors in the dorm saw him take a shower at about 5 a.m., but he and Kristen said goodbye a little after 2 a.m. In addition, the young man had a black eye and scratches on his knees. When asked by several people, he told 3 different stories about where these injuries came from. Paul Flores looked extremely suspicious, but there was no direct evidence against him. A month had passed since Kristen disappeared, and the police expanded the search area to her hometown. The journalists there blew the case out of proportion, pointing out the similarities of this story with the plot of a popular TV series, Twin Peaks. The news even mentioned some psychics who had allegedly already solved the case. According to their theory, the girl was killed by two men on campus, and then they took her body to a cliff and threw it into the water. Of course, these statements didn't help the police. A year after Kristen disappeared, her parents filed a lawsuit against Flores, accusing him of involvement in the disappearance of the girl. In 1997, Paul testified under oath, but he only answered one question when he was asked to give his name. All other questions, he referred to the Fifth Amendment that allows the accused persons not to testify against themselves. After that, Paul's parents sued Kristen's family, accusing them of causing moral damage. But both of these lawsuits didn't go anywhere. The police had no evidence to bring Paul to justice. On May 25, 2002, on the 6th anniversary of Kristen's disappearance, the authorities officially pronounced her dead. During all this time, they failed to come any closer to solving this case. This continued until 2018, when California resident Chris Lambert decided to launch his podcast series dedicated to various crimes. He was 8 years old at the time of Kristen's disappearance, and he remembered this terrible story quite well. After 22 years, he decided to conduct his own investigation and was amazed at how careless the police was all this time. The first thing Chris decided to do was to talk to all the witnesses of those events. From the students of the university, he learned that Paul Flores had a bad reputation. The young man repeatedly harassed the students, but no one filed any official complaints. Chris further analyzed the actions of the police and came to the conclusion that they made a number of critical mistakes. The detectives came to the house of Paul's father, Ruben Flores, only 2 months after the girl's disappearance. Given that Paul lived with his father, the police had to immediately investigate the apartment. But when the police finally came to scour the place, it was carried out extremely carelessly. The detectives didn't bring any forensic scientists and service dogs trained to smell decay. The search was basically useless because of this. The detectives also failed to inspect the 2 cars of the Flores family, one of which Paul could use to drive Kristen from campus to his father's house. A few months after the police searched the house, one of the cars was sold, and the second one was allegedly stolen. The police didn't search Paul's mother's house at all, and it turned out that one of the main pieces of evidence was hidden there. Chris Lambert found out that 4 months after Kristen disappeared, a woman named Mary Lassiter rented Paul's mother's house. She found an earring in one of the rooms which looked a lot like the necklace worn by Kristen at the time of her disappearance. This necklace was also in photographs of the girl posted on billboards around the neighborhood. Mary noticed this similarity and took the earring to the police. And what do you think? At first, the police refused to include this piece of evidence in the case file, and later completely lost the earring. But what Chris found out next is truly shocking. The yard in Paul's mother's house was always covered in concrete, but soon after Kristen disappeared, a piece of concrete was cut out of there and they put a flower bed in its place. It already seems weird, but it gets even more interesting. Mary Lassiter, who rented this house, shared a very creepy fact with Chris. After she first moved, she kept hearing a sound every day at 4:20 a.m. and 4:20 p.m. This sound reminded her of an alarm clock of a digital wristwatch. The sound came from the backyard of the house, straight from under that same flower bed. One day, the sound stopped. Either the alarm clock ran out of battery, or it was dug up and moved. Chris Lambert went to Kristen's mother to talk about it. After hearing the story about the alarm clock, the woman was speechless from shock and couldn't utter a word for several minutes. She then said that Kristen always set her alarm for 4:20 a.m. because she had to be at work at the campus recreation center at 5 a.m. When Lambert's podcast was posted in 2019, more than 6 million people listened to it. The public was shocked that the police had been inactive all this time and didn't put the killer in prison. The new clues discovered by Chris only increased the uproar. As a result, the police department decided to reopen the case, and this time, more than 20 years later, they finally did what they needed to do. They searched 4 locations, including Paul Flores's house. At first, the police said that they managed to find some evidence that could be useful to the investigation. On January 29, 2020, the law enforcement officials announced that they had seized 2 of Paul's cars as evidence. Later, it became known that they finally dug up the courtyard in the house of Paul's mother, but Kristin's body wasn't there. However, the police said that they managed to find evidence that there were indeed signs of decomposition of a human body under the flower bed. On February 11, 2021, news broke out that Paul Flores had been arrested. But the reason for this wasn't Kristin's disappearance, but the possession of an unregistered weapon. On March 15th, a judge issued a search warrant for Paul's father's house, and on April 13th, both the father and the son were taken into custody in the case of Kristin's disappearance. The court brought murder charges against Paul, and his father was accused of being an accomplice. According to the investigation, when Paul and Kristin were left alone, the young man started making advances towards her, but she turned him down. This explains why he was scratched and bruised. During the struggle, Paul could kill Kristin, then load her body into the car and take her to his house. Then he and his father buried the body in the backyard of his mother's house and disguised this place as a flower bed. After some time, they decided to dig up the remains and move them to some unknown place. The father and the son pleaded not guilty, and the trial is still ongoing. However, with all the facts and all the available evidence, they're unlikely to be able to escape punishment, even if this whole thing happened 25 years ago. Kristin's parents made a public statement thanking Chris Lambert and millions of other people who participated for the fact that together they were finally able to find out the truth. Now, all we can do is wait until the trial is over and the criminals receive their punishment.